All right, welcome back everybody to another Beyond the Check ride. How you doing, Kent?
Excellent.
You're not going to say your thing about talking about flying?
Well, I feel like I said it already. I kind of did.
True story. All right. Well, we're back again to record another Beyond the Check ride. So, Kent, what's our topic?
Descent planning.
Mm,
This isn't nearly as juicy as some of the other ones we've
yeah,
done, but
I don't even know that we can get a controversy going on this one. I'm sure we could figure
um
something out.
I think we can. I think we can just because of the last thing on the list there.
All right. This is how I do
We'll try.
it. Excellent. So, where do we start with this one?
Well, we start in cruise, I think.
That's a good place to descend from.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to descend from the ground. So now let me ask, as a somewhat less experienced pilot, how do you plan your descents?
I told you, I just kind of wing it. Just kidding.
Well,
Um,
I mean, honestly, I remember when I was working on my private, doing my first few dual cross countries. It was kind of like, oh, well, I can see the airport right up there, and I should probably start coming down now because it looks like I'm, significantly higher than a glide slope should be. But it was in a 172, so you just pull the throttle back and you practically fall out of the sky, and it's all good. Don't have to worry about it, right?
yeah, you remember doing the paper flight plans, when you were doing your private?
Time, fuel, and distance to descend.
Yeah. You had to use the POH and you had to have a top of descent there and you had to do all that figuring beforehand. We actually have a bit of a cheat code these days with Foreflight. I don't know if everybody who uses Foreflight kind of casually knows this, but if you send your flight plan to the flight tab, it'll create something that's very similar to those those old paper flight plans that we did with all of the detailed numbers. Those are in there. So that's another way that I actually sometimes do look at that for descent planning.
So what
But
you're talking about is the nav log,
the nav
correct?
log, yep. The
And
nav
that,
log.
yeah, it'll put a top of climb, top of descent into the nav log.
Yep.
Another Foreflight trick you can use, even if you're not using flights, if you just have maps, flip from the edit view over to the profile view,
Yep.
and you can see where your top of climb and descent are, and then you can actually go and add a uh,
A
a
waypoint
waypoint
there.
there if you'd like.
Yeah. Now that does require that you have a certain level. I don't believe that profile view works in all levels, but yeah, that's really handy. But to get back to your original question, I've always used that old rule of thumb. If I didn't really plan it beforehand and I don't have a nav log and, all those things, where you plan for about 3 nautical miles per 1,000 feet that you got to descend. And of course, you take whatever your cruise altitude is and you subtract whatever the pattern altitude is from it. And that gives you your amount to descend. And then you kind of do that. I'm going to need 3 to 4 nautical miles for every 1,000 feet that I want to descend. In a small piston. It, it's probably not that good, but it's close. And I guess that's what rules of thumb are. And so that'll get you
Right.
close enough for making sure that you don't have to circle about 6 times to get down to pattern altitude once you get to the airport. So,
Yeah. Well, that 3 miles per thousand, that's a rule of thumb that even large transport jet pilots will
oh,
use.
really? Okay.
But, I have heard some interesting equations and more specific rules of thumb, but one of them is that for a 3-degree descent, which I think is roughly what the 3 miles per thousand is, for that 3-degree descent, your rate of descent in feet per minute is about your ground speed times 5.
Mm,
So if you're at 90 knots, multiply that by 5, it's 450. 450 feet per minute. Great. So you're descending in a cub or something.
Yeah. But if you're descending in
Wonderful.
something fast, that is going to be a sporty descent.
Yeah. Yeah, and when you fly something in the higher altitudes, all that stuff breaks down because in a TBM at, say, 27,000 feet, you might be in cruise, truing out at 330 or something like that. You might even pick up 40 or 50 knots in the descent because you're coming down fairly quick and you're in that descent for a long time. So the plane's got a good chance to speed up while you're going downhill. But then as you start getting into thicker and thicker air, your true airspeed keeps going down and down and down the whole time. So the rules of thumb are always kind of straight lines, but reality is a little bit more curved in something like that. Um, Now, I don't use 3 miles per thousand in my plane because I like to be passenger friendly
And
and I'm
those moonies are
generally
pretty
descending.
slippery. Yeah,
They are very slippery. That's what everybody likes about them, you
that's
know.
right.
In cruise, I true out at about 170 to 175 knots on 12 gallons an hour. And yeah, that's what I love about the plane. However, I'm doing about, figure 180 in the descent. If there's no wind, use that same rule of thumb. And now I'm doing 900 feet per minute. I don't really necessarily like doing that with passengers in an unpressurized airplane. 500 feet per minute is good and passenger friendly. So that's generally what I would recommend people stick to when they have an unpressurized airplane. But when you get into some that are faster, well, now you need a little bit more room to descend.
Yeah.
So, what I think of is, 180 knots is 3 miles per minute. And if I'm wanting to descend at 500 feet per minute, it's 2 miles or 2 minutes rather per thousand feet. So that means with no wind, I'm looking at 6 miles per thousand feet. Now, I'm a nerd and I'm really good at doing math in my head, so I always correct for the wind. I pretty much figure just based on experience, I know that I'm going to gain about 10 knots in the descent at 500 feet per minute. And so I just kind of look at my ground speed and add 10 knots to it. And then I kind of start looking at that miles per minute number. So every 60 knots is another mile per minute. So I usually go maybe to the nearest quarter or something like that. So if I've got a good headwind going and I'm getting 165, that's 2 and 3/4 miles per minute or 5.5 per thousand feet. And then like you said, the key is to kind of figure out where you are and where you're going. Figure out how many thousands of feet you're going to descend and go from there. Any questions about using math at all?
um, what's math? No, I'm just kidding.
Well, there are people who are good pilots who are not good at math, and that's just fine. I know there's a lot of people out there who think that you have to be super good at math to be a pilot. You don't. There's a rule of thumb for everything. So,
Yeah. Not
um,
to mention we fly with like 6 computers now at our fingertips.
right.
So,
And that's kind of where I was going next is there's avionics and EFBs and stuff like that we can also use for our descent planning. For example, in my airplane, I have a Garmin 750, and because I also have a GI 275 attitude indicator that supplies all the information that the 750 needs to make the calculation, I have the VNAV capability. All those Garmins have either the VNAV or the VCalc. So if you don't have anything but the GPS, you'll have VCalc, which just basically helps you do the math. And then VNav, you actually tell it, okay, I want to be at 1,000 feet off the ground, 5 miles prior to my destination, and it will calculate a path through the sky and it will tell you 1 minute to top of descent, and then it'll calculate a vertical path that you can actually follow. I have a vertical CDI on my attitude indicator that I can follow down. And if you have their fancy autopilot, you can actually have the autopilot do it all
Just
automatically.
fly the descent for you.
Yep. Um, and since I have plenty of experience with Garmin autopilots, let me throw this one thing in here. There's three things you got to do to make that work. First thing is you have to actually hit the VNAV button. That is pretty obvious. Second thing is you need to have that point programmed into your flight plan with the altitude so that it knows where it's going. And third, you have to take your altitude bug and set it to the altitude you want to go to. And if you do all three of those things, then it will capture that vertical path that it has calculated and follow it down without you having to touch anything.
There's one more thing you got to do though, and especially in your airplane, you got to pull that power back.
I actually leave my power as is for the most part early in the descent.
Early, yeah,
Um,
maybe, but in your airplane, you
and
might get
that's
going pretty fast.
so the reason I say that is that I was just kind of thinking about when you get into a faster airplane like that, you're not looking at the airport on the descent anymore. I think
Hmm.
I remember starting a descent 62 miles out once in the moon. So, if you're on a longer trip and you get up into maybe the low teens or something like that, or up around 10,000 in altitude anyway, you've got a ways to come down and then you get a tailwind happening and all that. It's pretty normal for me on a cross country trip to be starting my descent 40, 50, 60 miles out. Um,
Airport
and
not in
so,
sight.
no, no, not at all. So, yeah, I am not pulling my power back early on because, especially at those altitudes in a normally aspirated
Yep.
airplane,
Yep.
I'm only pulling 18, 19, 20 inches of manifold pressure. And so my power is already pretty low.
True.
So, generally, what I do is and this is where we're going to have the controversy shock cooling and power reductions. There are plenty of arguments over whether shock cooling is actually a thing in this industry. Some people say, it's a bunch of hogwash. Some people say, well, if you don't give it 5 minutes per inch of manifold pressure, then you're going to blow up your engine. Well,
Both are pretty
neither
extreme,
one of
I'm
those,
guessing.
right. Neither one of those things is 100% true. It's probably somewhere in the middle, but honestly, the fastest your engine cools down is after you shut it down anyway. So,
Yep.
there are people who work really hard to keep power settings up. They use things like speed brakes to basically keep their power setting up and not have as much air flowing over the engine. I don't go to that extreme, but I also figure, okay, if I act as if shock cooling is a thing, what's the downside? And so what I do is I start pulling power back usually about 20 miles out, and I might be at up to 24 inches of manifold pressure at some point. And so, yeah, at 20 miles out, I'll knock it down to 22. And at 15 miles out, I'll take it down to 20. And then 10 miles out, I'll go to 17. And 5 miles out, I go to 14. And I might add 5 miles to those on an IFR flight just so that I'm slowed down and I'm ready to drop my gear at the final approach fix because you're right. It's a very slippery airplane that I'm flying. And so I only lose about 5 knots through those first three power reductions. And it's only that last one. I would say usually when I go from 17 to 14, I'm still doing about 155 indicated, and my gear speed is 140. So, yeah, I have to get slowed down to 140, and 14 inches is about as low as I can get the throttle before the gear warning starts squawking. And
Right.
so, I have to let it sit there for a couple of minutes before it'll slow down enough to drop the gear. Then once I drop the gear, it'll slow down real nicely. But in an instrument approach type of scenario, I figure, okay, I'm going to
Get
be
it slowed
dropping the
down
gear
early.
when I'm
Yeah.
5 miles out anyway. So I definitely need to be low enough to drop the gear at the final approach fix.
Right. Well, that's
So
good.
yeah, I'll
Yeah.
add a little for that. But yeah, I don't just pull back the power at the top of the descent anymore. That's for back in the day when I was flying the 172 and looking at the airport before I started the descent. So
You can practice your emergency descents just right over the airport.
yeah, well, That's something the Mooney actually does quite well. When I my emergency descent procedure is to slow down to gear speed, throw the speed brakes out, slow down to gear speed as quick as possible, drop the gear, and then I will say that I've never pushed the nose down as far as you're supposed to because it actually says you should then accelerate back up to your maximum gear extended speed, which is 164 indicated.
Oh my
And with the
goodness.
gear and the flaps and sorry, not the flaps, the gear and the speed brakes out, there is no blue left in the windscreen at that point. And I've never actually gotten it back up to 164 knots.
It sounds fun though. Sounds
Oh
really
yeah,
fun.
that I mean it'll really fall out of the sky when you do that. But
Hmm.
anyway,
So,
getting a little off
so,
topic there,
so
but
that's your typical
that's an
descent
extreme
plan then?
descent.
Just kidding. So let me ask you, Kent, in practical terms, these days, you were to do a cross country tomorrow, would you be allowing Foreflight to set up your nav log and you'd kind of follow that? Or would you be doing that math in your head, figuring it out and doing it on your own? What's your typical MO these days?
My typical MO is just to do the math in my head based on my actual ground speed. Winds are never as they were forecast, of course, and
True.
Foreflight is going to be using those forecast winds. And so that's pretty much why I do it that way. But that's not to say that the forecasts are completely made up out of whole cloth either. They come from somewhere and there is some level of accuracy to them. So if you just go ahead and, maybe start with that and adjust as necessary, that's fine too. There's a lot of ways to skin this cat.
Yeah.
So,
Especially with that VNAV support in
yeah.
the GPS, which is going to take into account wind and other things.
Yeah, and I will say that one thing that it does not take into account is the extra speed that you're going to get
Oh,
when you start
from
the
the
descent.
descent. Got it.
So, for those of you who do have that equipment, obviously the Garmin stuff is really popular. If you're going to use that VNAV feature, it does let you set up the path as a feet per minute sort of thing. So you can tell it you want 500 feet per minute, but it's going to calculate the path based on a 500 foot per minute descent at your current speed.
Mm,
And so in reality, if you leave the power in on the descent, you're going to accelerate when you
yeah.
start going down. And so it's going to be more than 500 feet per minute at that point. And then same thing with what we were talking about before with true airspeeds changing as your altitude changes.
Yeah.
As you get into thicker air and start slowing down, it's going to affect your vertical speed as well. But, it's a great starting point and it doesn't change by that much
Yeah.
in most circumstances.
Yeah. And
So,
the difference
however you do it,
and the difference between a 650-foot per minute descent and a 500-foot per minute descent is generally not going to be a big deal.
right, most people won't notice the difference there.
Yeah.
Now, one thing that we haven't really talked about is we've been focusing our passenger comfort discussion here mostly on the ear issues that a lot of people have if you start doing really fast descents. Most people may have learned how to clear their ears on an airline flight or something like that. And of course, with a pressurized airplane, they're going to keep the cabin rate of descent fairly reasonable. So that's why we do our descents that way, even though our cabin is the same as the outside. However, another thing to think about is especially if it's a hot, bumpy day, as you're descending from cruise altitude, you may be in nice, cool, smooth air when
Yeah.
you're in cruise. And then you get down to 4,000 or 5,000 feet, and all of a sudden it's hot and bumpy and humid. And
Pretty
well,
uncomfortable.
now somebody who has motion sickness might not handle that too well. And so
Yeah.
if that's the case, you might want to plan on pulling back the power and maybe even leveling out to slow down a little bit and kind of maybe having like a two-stage descent in a way.
Yeah. Good idea. Hadn't really thought of that before.
Okay, so with a two-stage descent, what I mean is, the first stage would be in the smooth air where you're going to be at a real low descent gradient because you're still going fast. And then once you get to those altitudes where it's hot and bumpy and you want to slow down so that maybe your motion sick passengers aren't feeling it as much, once you slow down, you're going to end up with a higher
Going
descent
pretty
gradient.
steep. Yep.
Right.
Yep. Get through that bumpy hot air as quick as possible and get on the ground. Yep.
Yep. Yeah. And at that point, vertical speed is your friend.
Right. Right. Awesome. Well, that's good stuff for people to be thinking about when they're planning their descent on their next cross country. Anything we've forgotten? Anything you want to cover before we end?
Well, I think the only thing we really didn't necessarily talk about in great detail was the where are you going to? So VFR, it's usually either going to be pattern altitude, or I've found that if I plan all the way down to field elevation, that works pretty well anyway. Because,
Get
like
there
I said,
early.
my plane
Yep.
is going down about 6 miles per 1,000 feet. So I'm at pattern altitude 6 miles from the airport as well. So that really depends on the plane you fly, of course. But, if you're IFR, there's maybe more that is going to have to go into it depending on the approach procedure that you're going to fly and how you're going to get to the approach procedure and what all your various minimum altitudes are. So
Yep.
just be aware of that, especially if there's any sort of terrain around, or you look at the approach plate and there's a bunch of different step downs, or maybe your minimum en route altitude in the area is quite a bit higher than the approaches. You might have some more thinking that goes into it at that point.
Yep. In some cases, you might even want to do a descent and a hold if
Yeah.
you don't want to go down as fast. So,
Yeah.
um,
I mean, there was one time that I was flying the Mooney into Jackson Hole, and there is a very long descent at the end of that. Start the approach from the Denor VOR, and minimum altitude there is 14,000 feet. And I was looking at it going, oh, this is going to be a little bit of a challenge to get down. And so I think I extended my gear at like 7,000 AGL or something like that, just to help get down at that point.
yeah,
But
slow it down so you can get a better angle. Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
So yeah, things are always more fun out west, right?
Always. Always makes it more challenging. Excellent. Well, Kent, great topic. Thanks again. Appreciate you coming on and doing these Beyond the Check rides, and I hope everybody's enjoying them and getting something out of them. So, as usual, reach out to us if you have any comments or disagreements with how we do this, any great ideas that you want us to pass along. Reach out to us and let us know. You can reach me at bill@studentpilotcast.com and a bunch of other ways you can find us on social media, I'm sure. So, thanks again. And until next time, Kent, we'll see you.
All right. We'll see you. Fly safe.